Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here again at Qatar University, just discussing with Abdullah. It's actually our third joint event, and of course it's also a testimony to the partnership and relationship we have with Abdullah, the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University, and Qatar University more generally. And let me also recognize, if we have him here, our visiting joint fellow at Qatar University, Brookings Doha Center, fellow Alex Henry. Yeah. He's teaching a class. Okay, good. It's my great pleasure to invite you all to, I'm sure you'll agree, a very interesting and timely event on the US 2016 US elections and their impact on the Middle East. In respect of that, I'm very, very grateful and happy to have not only Abdullah with us, but Dr. John Hudak, a fellow in the Government Studies and Managing, fellow in the Government Studies program at Brookings and Managing Editor of the Fixed Gov blog at Brookings, which you haven't seen before, but I'd highly recommend. Additionally, he focuses on campaigns and elections, bureaucratic processes, and legislative executive interaction. I'd also recommend to you John's new book, which is called Presidential Pork: White House Influence over the Distribution of Federal Grants, demonstrates that pork barrel politics, which is basically using government funds for political gain, occurs beyond the halls of Congress. John's work has been recognized for its quality and contribution by the Midwest Political Science Association and the American Political Science Association's Presidential Research Group. Prior to joining Brookings, and yes, there is life before Brookings, I guess, John served as the program director and as graduate fellow at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. He holds a BA in Political Science and Economics from the University of Connecticut and an MA and PhD in Political Science from Vanderbilt University. John, you've been here for the last few days in Doha. I know you've been enjoying yourself, doing a number of lectures. You're very much part of the cross-center collaboration that Brookings is promoting within us, and so it's great to have you here in Doha. Let me also introduce a man who doesn't really require an introduction, but I will.
Dr. Abdullah Babood, friend, and who's of course the director of the Gulf Studies Center here at Qatar University. Abdullah graduated with a Master's in Business Administration, Master's in International Relations, as well as a PhD in International Relations from the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. Abdullah has a general interest in international politics and economics, particularly in the areas of globalization and regionalism. His research interests also focus on the GCC states, economic, social and political development, and the GCC's external relations more generally. He's published extensively, as you know. He's presented and attended several international seminars and workshops, and of course holds board memberships for several business organizations and committees. You've kindly agreed not only to be a partner for today's event, but also to act as a discussant to John's initial presentation. Of course, the 2016 presidential election will have a unique focus on foreign policy, in particular because the candidates from both parties will be eager to discuss the topic, and for very different reasons. And there, of course, the Middle East will likely feature quite heavily. Democrats and Republicans both see foreign policy as a winning topic, and as such, nations across the world will get a preview of the positions, values, and perspectives of the future American president, long before he or she takes office. So I'm not going to speak for too much longer. I will, getting into this, ask John, is it going to be Hillary? And what positions will they take on the Middle East? In fact, does the Middle East matter so much to the US electorate? And then, of course, If it does, what about Iran? Is the US going to continue to hand over this region to the Iranians? And our changing demographics and other conditions mean that the US electorate perhaps is less focused on the Middle East more generally. Those are just some of the questions. I'm sure there will be many more. John is going to make an initial presentation. Abdullah will then respond, and then we will make sure that we have plenty of time for you to ask your questions. John, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to Qatar University and the Gulf Studies program for hosting today. This is a really interesting opportunity. I don't teach anymore, but I really savor the opportunity to speak to groups like these because I always get the best questions. Don't tell that to any of the other groups I've spoken to this week. But my expectations are very high that the questions are going to be very good today, so please don't let me down. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2016 election in an abbreviated form so we can open it up to a more organic conversation and hopefully address all of Salman's questions as I go through. The first thing I'll talk a little bit about is how the American presidential election system works. I'll give an abbreviated overview of that. What's going to be unique about the 2016 election, and why finally it's important for this region. And then perhaps maybe try to answer the million-dollar question about who the next president is going to be. So the American presidential election system is a complex, often difficult to understand, and often crazy system, to be bluntly honest. It now begins about 2 years before Election Day, and it begins with the parties choosing their nominees through a series of primaries in all 50 states, as well as the District of Columbia and our territories as well, like Puerto Rico and Guam and elsewhere. The parties vie, the candidates from the parties vie to become their nominee, to go through this rigorous and often brutal and always expensive primary process just for the opportunity to go through another brutal and rigorous process in the general election that is also quite expensive and increasingly expensive over time. So as the parties finally winnow down and decide who their nominee is going to be, the general election begins. And while the general election really is happening simultaneously with the primaries, it officially begins when the candidates, the nominees, accept the party's nomination, which is sometime in the middle of the summer of 2016, quite shortly before the actual election happens itself. And the election, of course, in the United States is not a national plebiscite like it is in a lot of nations around the world, but we use an electoral college where instead of running in one big national election, the candidates for the presidency of the United States actually run in 50 individual state elections, and whoever wins each state gets a set of votes based on the population of that state, and you combine all those together, and whoever reaches 270 of those votes, a true majority, is elected president. So that process has already begun. The primary process has already begun. We have multiple candidates from both parties who have announced that they'll be running. They're raising money, they're giving speeches, they're attacking each other, all those good American traditions. And we're still 17 or 18 months away. It's nice when the candidates do talk about issues because there's a lot of time in which they don't. They talk about each other, they talk about scandals, they talk about things that a lot of people don't care about, but they also talk eventually about issues that matter. And this election is going to be unique in a lot of ways, as Salman mentioned. A lot of American presidential elections focus on the economy. The economy is something that's a basic and important part of the life of every individual across the world. What you want from your government, what you expect from your government, is an improved place, is to do well, is to meet whatever goals you have, whether those goals are economic success, success for your children, success for your household, however you define success, they often center around economic life. And in the United States, voters' attitudes and voters' choices and voters' interests typically center around that too. And this election will be no different. Economic issues will matter. But in this election, it's unique because foreign policy is going to matter in a way that it often doesn't. We've had a few foreign policy elections in the past. 2004 was one of them. Shortly after the American intervention in Afghanistan in 2002, and then the American invasion in Iraq in 2003, all, of course, coming on the heels of the September 11th terrorist attacks, security, defense, military matters, and foreign policy in general was chief on the minds of American voters. In addition, President Bush ran what was a fairly effective campaign that put both those issues and his position on those issues in the forefront. And of course, in 2004, these were two wars at the time that Americans supported pretty broadly. That changed dramatically in Bush's second term, but at the time, Americans supported those wars. So that was a foreign policy election. This year is going to be a good example of another one. And the reason is we have an individual who is running for president for the Democrats. She will be the nominee, Hillary Clinton. And she has a profound foreign policy background in a way that most Democrats don't. Democrats tend to be domestic policy oriented. And I won't say it's for the first time, but in a very stark way, she really represents a foreign policy mind within the Democratic Party and is an individual who's not afraid to A, talk about those issues, and B, defend her positions on those issues. She's eager to talk about it. It's a big part of her resume. It also helps overcome what are stereotypes or biases against women in politics, and that is that they're very domestic oriented and they don't care as much about foreign policy. So for her, it's a winning issue. Republicans think it's a winning issue for them too, because they see Obama as a weak leader. They see Clinton as vulnerable on foreign policy issues regarding Russia, regarding Libya, and in other parts of the world. And foreign policy is just the bread and butter. It's a really fundamental part of Republican politics, and so they're eager to talk about it too. Oftentimes, foreign policy is the domain of one party, usually the Republican Party, or it's an area that no one wants to talk about. In the 2000 presidential election in the United States, America was at peace. We weren't in the midst of terrorist attacks. No one really talked much about foreign policy. No one cared about it. It wasn't high on the list of interests of Americans, and it certainly wasn't high on the interests of the two-party nominees, Al Gore and George Bush. But this is an election that's unique because people are both sides are so interested in it. But there's more, there are more issues that will come up as well. But again, the focus on foreign policy is what makes it unique. What else is unique are the people running. We have a former Secretary of State, a former senator, the wife of a former president, running against the brother and son of a former president. By my count, there are probably going to be at least 15 Republicans running for president this time, which is a few more than last time, some of them serious, some of them seriously worrisome, but a lot of candidates. On the Democratic side, something unique is happening. You have essentially one candidate. There are a few people, there's one other person who's declared he's running, the junior senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders. Governor O'Malley from our state of Maryland has suggested he'll be announcing in a few days. But in reality, they don't have any chance of beating Clinton. She has a level of popularity among Democrats that is typically only enjoyed by an incumbent president. Her numbers are pretty close to Barack Obama's in 2012. Candidates don't enjoy that level of comfort and level of support in American presidential elections. It happens in congressional elections sometimes. It happens in Senate races or governor's races in the US. But it doesn't happen in presidential elections, particularly for an individual who's not a sitting vice president. Al Gore had some support like this, though not quite as high. George H.W. Bush had support like this, but not quite as high. And so she occupies this unique position in American politics, and it makes this a really interesting election. Another interesting part of this election is going to be money. As all of you know, money in politics in the United States is a growing issue. Some people think it's a problem, some people think it's a constitutional right. But in 2016, there's not just a presidential election in the United States. We'll elect a president, we'll elect the entire lower house of our legislature, 1/3 of our upper house, we'll elect some state governors, we'll elect most of our state legislatures. There will be mayorships on the ballot, municipal elections, there will be ballot referenda on some ballots in states. And the expectation is that this election will cost somewhere between 5 to 7 or 8 billion American dollars. That's a lot of money. Hillary Clinton wants to raise 2 billion of those dollars. Republicans are probably going to raise 2 billion as well. And this will by far be the most expensive presidential election in American history, but probably the most expensive election in world history. And the impact that that's going to have on the issues, on the nature and character of the people running, is going to be remarkable. I live in a swing state, a competitive state in a presidential race, Virginia. And I see that spending firsthand. Now, my personal opinions about the role of money in politics aside, I can tell you nothing is worse than living in one of these states before a presidential election, because every commercial break is literally only campaign ads. So even the candidate you like, you stop liking because you're so sick of seeing that person's face on your TV all day long. It becomes almost oppressive, the amount of contact that you have with campaigns, because campaigns have grown so expensive and are so driven by money and strategy. And that's going to be something that the last election was unique in that it was more expensive than the previous one, and this election will be unique because it will be dramatically more expensive than the last. So I'll offer a few more points and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Some of the other important issues that I think are going to matter to this region are important ones. Foreign policy being so high on the agenda in 2016 is obviously something that's going to matter here. And as Salman said in the opening remarks, it presents a real opportunity. Because sometimes when you have a race for the American presidency or someone trying to become Prime Minister of the UK or Chancellor of Germany, you really don't know what that individual is going to be like as a player on the world stage. You don't have a full appreciation of what their foreign policy views, their worldview is, what they might think about intervening or not intervening in certain parts of the world. But when foreign policy is at the forefront of the conversations and every nominee or every candidate for office really wants to talk about that issue, you're going to have a good idea of what they think about ISIL or Yemen or Afghanistan or relations with this region in general, or our trade and military alliances with the EU, what the candidates' positions are on Russia, on Israel, on East Asia. This is going to be a big part of the conversation, and the benefit it delivers to the world is that there won't be as much of a guessing game around the views and positions of the next American president. You're probably going to have a pretty good idea of what that's going to be like months in advance of that person taking the oath of office. In addition, trade and economic activity is going to be a real driver in this election. Economic issues are going to matter, as I said at the outset, for most Americans, but it's also going to matter as part of a foreign policy perspective from both parties, particularly with Clinton as the nominee for Democrats. Her time as Secretary of State was largely marked by an approach to diplomacy in which economics played a very central role in terms of opening up relations with countries where relations were struggling, or as a platform to address other issues that were very close to her heart, like human rights. That's not going to change in her run for president. At the same time, Republicans driven by capitalism and free market ideas oftentimes are some of America's biggest supporters of open and free trade. And so those issues are going to be drivers not just of domestic economic policy, but of foreign policy as well. if Clinton, as the nominee, as the Democratic nominee, Clinton will also focus on other issues that matter to this region: energy policy, both domestic exploration in the United States, as well as energy policy abroad, and climate change, something this nation is working to address, many nations across the world are looking to address. Seemingly the only people in the world who aren't looking to address it are American Republicans. But if she's, as the nominee, and if she's elected president, that will occupy a pretty big part of her agenda, and one again in which she would likely be able to connect with other nations on, because other nations in the world are dealing with this, many nations in the world are dealing with it in a head-on way. Depending on whether Clinton or a Republican is the nominee, it's going to matter a lot for American approaches to global intervention, to the role of diplomacy in a foreign policy perspective. And those are all issues that matter not just to this region in specific terms, but I think this region's perspective of the American administration of foreign policy, which a lot of times that perception, that perspective from our allies abroad like Qatar is at times just as important as the actual actions taken by a White House. There are going to be stark differences in the way that the two parties want to administer foreign policy in the U.S. I would argue that the rhetoric around the campaign will probably show a lot more difference between the parties than the actual policies that they ultimately pursue as president. But regardless, you'll have a pretty good idea of the types of policies they'll be supporting and how those policies will impact this part of the world. And then I'll finish on the million-dollar question, which was, is Clinton going to be president? My answer to that is almost certainly.
I don't know if you're getting a round of applause for that prediction, or, but thank you very much. You've already set the scene for a uniquely focused $8 billion foreign policy presidential campaign and election, and saying it comes at a particular time in history, both for the American nation, but also for the Middle East at this point in time. I thank you. I thank you very much. Let me recognize, by the way, those who are watching on Al Jazeera Mubashir. It's great to have you with us again. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Abdullah Babood. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Salman, and it's a great pleasure and an honor to actually work with Brookings Doha Center to organize such an important event. And as Salman has said, this is one of a series of events that we have worked in the past at the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University and the Brookings Doha Center have organized together. And it also gives me a great opportunity to welcome John Haddock, and in our earlier conversation, he told me this is his first visit to the region. So you're not only being exposed to the harsh weather, but maybe you'll be exposed to some harsh questions from the attendants. At the outset, I would just like to also congratulate you on your talk, and I'd like to say that my intervention here is going to be more focused on how the Middle East sees the United States. We believe, and I agree with you, that this is a very unique year, or the election is going to be a very unique election in 2016, in a sense that the world is changing so dramatically in front of our eyes, at the global level, at the regional level, at the energy level as well. And there are, of course, problems everywhere. You just have to look around in the map and you see that there are so many issues that we need, that are facing us. In the Middle East in particular, this is a very interesting election because it really touches upon a lot of important issues. The Middle East is going through a very dramatic change, as you all know, and going through a real turmoil that is affecting the whole region. Again, you look at the Middle Eastern map and it's very difficult to see that there isn't a country that has been affected by this one way or the other. And of course, for the Middle East, there are a number of very important issues. And I would put one issue at the forefront, although at the moment I feel that it has gone down in the pack of orders, if you like, because of other pressing issues. And that is the issue of Palestine and the issue of the Arab-Israeli peace process and the Arab peace plan that was put on the forefront at 2002. Again, we would, from the region, we would like to see what is the United States' interest in resolving this lingering conflict that is affecting everybody and affecting both the Palestinians and the Israelis and the Arabs. And in fact, the contours of the agreement is almost there. And what is needed is that final push that needed a leader, a hegemonic leader like the United States, to make that push. Unfortunately, we don't see the United States doing that, and this is not the United States bashing, but this is how people see it from the region, that the United States is not really serious about the peace plan. In fact, if anything, there has been, it has dropped in the list of orders on the policy agenda of the United States. And I think until this is being tackled head on, it is going to always be a lingering issue in terms of people in the Middle East and how they look at the United States as a power that wants to have peace and wants to propagate stability and wants to propagate cooperation. Why can they not move and edge this relationship, this agreement, and make sure that it is, we see the fruition of that. The region is full of conflicts, and we don't need this lingering conflict to continue, and it has an overall effect on everything else. Also, people in the Middle East, here we look at what the United States policy is since the Gulf region, and the region has become under the Pax Americana, as it were. And we see that there's been at least 3 major wars, plus a lot of other conflicts. And if you look back into the history, and you see that, during the Pax Britannica, these kinds of wars and conflicts were hardly mentioned or existed. And, people wonder here, what has America done to the region? Since they took over, since they became, if you like, the guarantors of the Gulf security, of the region's security, this region has been plagued by conflicts and wars and so on, with a lot of devastation on human and material cost. And that is something that people question, to what extent is this American leadership is effective in managing conflicts in the region. The Iraqi invasion is something that people always bring up to the question here. And why did the United States do that when they have been advised by all the the regional governments that this is something that is going to create even more havoc in the region? And we've seen what the havoc that it is creating in front of our eyes today. Not only that, not only getting rid of a dictator like Saddam Hussein, which of course people applauded here, but dismantled all the state apparatus and left Iraq without institutions that can govern, and in effect supported what is effectively a sectarian government that people here look at, which has created what we now look at and see as and consider as terrorist organizations like ISIL and so on. And also people look at the United States position as far as their procrastination in terms of the Syrian crisis. You draw a red line and then you draw another red line and you don't deliver, and people don't take you seriously. I'm just kind of making some of these general observations. And even in Yemen, the Americans were very quick to withdraw their forces and even not shown the kind of support either to the Yemeni people, or there was no clear signal of where the United States stands on this. I'm not saying that they should be standing with the war, but we need the United States as a hegemonic and powerful international power to really have a position on this. And the nuclear issue in Iran is, of course, a major issue that we look at here. And we see how the Americans are now dealing with the Iranians. And there is a very strong fear amongst the Gulf states that perhaps the United States, having failed in securing the region, having failed in preventing conflicts, as I mentioned, is now returning to the old dual containment or old dual policy, the twin pillar, as it were, of having Iran and Saudi Arabia as two major powers in the region, and trying to always balance off these countries against each other. And I think there are signs that perhaps there is a déjà vu to that policy, that the United States is now talking to Iran, is now negotiating the nuclear deal, and they have not, despite the recent call to come to Camp David to all the Gulf leaders, they have not dispelled all the fears. And the Gulf states have shown their displeasure by, in fact, not many leaders have turned up, especially King Salman. And also the announcement that came out of the Camp David Accord, or the Camp David meeting, did not live up to the expectations that people were looking for in the region. And therefore, we see that all the United States wanted to do is sell more missiles and more arms to the region and create an arms race. Of course, some of the Gulf and regional governments are also part of this, but the United States is supporting that. And then, on one hand, we see the United States talking to Iran about the nuclear deal, which is, of course, a very important issue, averting what could be a catastrophic confrontation between Iran and the world community. But at the same time, we hear, like just a day or two before, we hear that the United States withdrawn its support for a Middle East nuclear-free zone in support of Israel. And there are, of course, questions that are raised here. That Israel, of course, does not want to open its arsenal, a nuclear arsenal, for international inspections. And the United States, instead of forcing the agenda on creating a nuclear-free Middle East, is actually went against it and supported the Israeli plan here. So these are some of the questions that really are coming up from the region. If you think they are hard, you should hear some of my other colleagues who even blame the United States for so many things. I'm not blaming the United States. I'm just trying to put forward, the fears, the feelings in the region, and what we hear from people here. So we feel in the Gulf that we are really entrapped within, being an ally of the United States, but we feel that we've been also, to a certain extent, being abandoned by the United States. The pivot towards Asia has created a lot of rupture here in terms of how people really take the United States seriously. And this is where the United States wanted to shift its balance, rebalance towards Asia. And now the United States is trying to rebalance the rebalance, which is also very confusing to many people. So there is a lot of confusion. There is a lot of mistrust also in the United States, even with its strongest allies in the Gulf states. And I would end by saying that I like your idea of thinking that Clinton is going to be the new president, and it will be great to have a woman with such an international experience leading a world global power. But I think it's only this morning there was some accusation about her receiving further funds to what is the Clinton Fund campaign from the Gulf states in exchange for arming the Gulf states. And to what extent is this going to affect her chances and reputation in the United States. I hope it doesn't. It will be great to have a woman finally in the United States, having had a black American leading this great power. So it'll be great to have a woman, but I hope this allegation does not really affect her and also does not affect the relationship with the Gulf states. President Clinton is, of course, a very consummate foreign affairs person, and she has a lot of experience and expertise to bring to the table. But again, her position regarding some of the Middle East issues raises a lot of questions, especially towards the first issue, which is very important to many people here, which is the Palestinian issue. And I think I will end with there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. That's great. And if we didn't know it before, the complexities of the issues when it comes to the Middle East that face the next US president are there for all to ponder. Whether you're talking about state breakdown or you're talking about key issues such as the Arab-Israeli conflict, Yemen, Syria, and of course the Iran balance or rebalance, as you say, and then of course the feelings of Gulf leaders, but also the citizens in this regard. So thank you very much. Let me take the liberty of asking the first set of questions, and then we'll open it up. John, how well versed when it comes to the Republican candidates? We're assuming Hillary will get the Democratic nomination. How well versed are the Republican candidates when it comes to the Middle East? And second, just I'll throw in a second one as well, taking both Hillary and the Republicans on a scale of interventionism or propensity to intervene, where do you put the candidates? If you could just spell out some of the main ones in that regard.
Well, it's first off, thank you for those comments. I'll try to address some of them as I go through some of the questions we have before us. So, in terms of Republican candidates' expertise on the Middle East, this is interesting. As I said, there are probably about 15 candidates who are going to run for president. Some of them have quite a bit of experience dealing with foreign policy issues. They've been in our Congress for a period of time. They have served on armed services committees and other committees of jurisdiction in the Congress that deal with these issues on a daily basis. Then there are others who have absolutely no experience in dealing with foreign affairs in any context. I think those people have those candidates have a much tougher time in actually getting the nomination, and here's why. The average American doesn't necessarily appreciate or understand all of the complexities of world affairs, particularly the affairs of this region of the world. They're highly complex. We have, people working on the issue who were not entirely confident understands the complexity of it. But Americans know this, that there are a lot of problems in the world. There are a lot of problems in this region, and they appreciate that they're complex. And what I think most Americans expect out of a presidential candidate is that that presidential candidate knows a little more about the issues than they do. And so what they're going to expect out of their next president is someone who can take the stage and show in a very clear way, this is my policy view, this is how I see the state of the world, and this is how I will proceed toward trying to fix some of these problems. The person who gets up there and paints a view of foreign policy in broad brushstrokes where everything is black and white and everything is simple, and you hear this from some Republican candidates, and frankly from some Democrats in Congress, they're not going to be successful. That oversimplification of the complexities of foreign policy will not play well in the American electorate. It might play well for some people, some voters, but it will be difficult for that person to overcome that policy ignorance in a way that positions them either to become the Republican nominee or then ultimately become president. And I think if the Republicans make the mistake of nominating an individual with very little foreign policy experience or very little grasp of foreign policy, and I'll distinguish those two. Some people can learn sufficiently and be ready for the job without having dealt with these issues in their policy-making life or in their business life before. And then there are others who seem almost opposed to learning. And so, sure.
Where would you put Governor Walker, one of the front runners on the Republican side in that respect? So
Governor Walker has no governing experience dealing with foreign policy, and while he was a businessman that had a position that naturally lends itself to understanding international finance and other international issues, he is someone who has openly committed to learning about these issues, and he has made remarkable progress, we'll say, over the past few weeks in his grasp of foreign policy, but at least it shows someone willing to invest the time to learn. And in that sense, you have candidates who are all over the map, like I said, some who really don't appreciate this conflict, a lot of people who consider Middle East issues, as I said, is oversimplified. The Israel-Palestine issue, there are people whose answer to that is Israel is our ally. Well, that's no answer. It's true, they're our ally, but it doesn't answer how you will then go about resolving it. And in fact, if that is your only answer, you're not going to go anywhere in resolving it. There is, I shouldn't even say almost, in some cases there is a religious commitment to Israel from some Republicans running for president, but it is something that I think can complicate the negotiation. And so this is, Republicans and Democrats both face serious challenges in terms of negotiating peace in the Middle East, negotiating peace on the Israel-Palestine issue. Republicans are, I would say, overly wedded to the alliance of Israel in a way that can jeopardize the quality and the progress of negotiations with Palestine. I think their recently demonstrated closeness to Prime Minister Netanyahu in opposition of the president's efforts, and frankly blindly to the implications of that relationship and the consequences of it elsewhere, suggests a real naivete when it comes to appreciating this conflict. For Democrats, there's this rift that has developed now between the Obama administration and the State of Israel, mostly not about policy, but about procedure and custom and propriety. Prime Minister Netanyahu coming to our Congress and giving a speech was, in the eyes of many Americans, an extraordinarily disrespectful act. In the eyes of many Democrats, a very disrespectful act, and that is especially true among Democratic elected officials. The ability to put aside that, and this is actually a series of actions that have irritated the Obama administration, including actions that happened around Vice President Biden's visit a few years ago, and a whole series of actions. That a Democrat is going to have to put away that resentment and come to the table cleanly to say, let's start from scratch, starting from scratch not in terms of negotiating terms, but in terms of putting away and forgetting these negative interactions that we've had, and let's try to fix this. Secretary Clinton's husband is seemingly magnificent at being able to compartmentalize on almost everything, but especially on this issue. For Republicans, they have to appreciate that there is another force in the Middle East other than the State of Israel that has claims and have policy claims and have interests in their economic and their geographic, and that at least hearing those issues is important. And so both parties come to this. I wish I could stay here and say, oh well, you know, if we just nominate, or if we just elect this person, they're going to fix what's going on there. I can't say that's for sure, because of these other, it's a complex problem that is now complicated by personalities and sort of defiant acts. And so that makes it troublesome. In terms of Republican candidates' penchant for intervention, they span the continuum. You have individuals like Rand Paul, the junior senator from Kentucky, who is as isolationist as I think you could be and still be a legitimate presidential contender. Then you have other people who just want to go to war everywhere. I'm not gonna put names on that, but there are people who you look at and you wonder whether there is an intervention that they would find distasteful, and they're very open about that. And then there's everything in between. Then there are people who see foreign policy in a nuanced way, that there is a time and a place for intervention, and there's a time and a place where you use diplomatic channels or you rely on other allies to do work. And then in terms of Clinton, I would say she's, by all accounts, more interventionist than the president, but certainly less interventionist than many Republicans. Obviously, she voted in favor of the Iraq invasion in 2003. She obviously voted to authorize the use of military force in Afghanistan. According to books that have been written about internal negotiations about foreign policy administration in Afghanistan and in Iraq, she was more hawkish than the president, more hawkish than the vice president. And so she's not going to be the Dove-type Democrat. She's not going to be non-interventionist, but she'll certainly be more moderate, I think, than many of the Republicans who she might face.
Very much. It's interesting that two of the leading candidates, Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush, of course, supported the Iraq War. It's also interesting that maybe the next president may well have to make a decision as to whether to intervene with boots on the ground in Iraq or Syria, for that matter. Thank you. Abdullah, it was great that you commended Pax Britannica. That's fantastic. And of course, Pax Americana has not been such a success. Just looking forward now, what would be your advice to the next, to the front runners in this presidential campaign, particularly in terms of Iran? Because you know, of course, that there is a fair amount of disquiet about how this president has managed the Iranian, not just a nuclear issue, but what is perceived as Iranian expansionism in the region. And I presume that is something which will be a live issue, which presidential candidates will be responding to. So what would be your advice here?
Does anybody pay for this advice? I think the best advice, if there was one, is to be honest and to be frank about the policy in the Middle East. You can't, one day have promotion of democracy, and then when you don't like what happens with that democracy, you change your mind. You can't say, we support political Islam, and then when political Islam wins the elections, you change your mind and you support a military junta. These things, of course, not only resonate with the leadership, but also with the people who do not really trust, these policies in the region. And they start, blaming that what is happening here is basically, rightly or wrongly, but there is a lot of course, conspiracy theory here. Blames the United States for everything that goes wrong anywhere in the world, except and especially here. And the idea of a constructive chaos also looms large here. Is this part of the Condoleezza Rice constructive chaos? If that's what is happening now in the Middle East. But I think my point is that the United States need to be clear about its policies in the region. And to be honest about them. You wanted peace and democracy. Well, let's have that peace and democracy, and start with the Palestinian Israeli, because you have a leverage there over Israel that you can actually push things forward. And we are only talking about, really the last few dots to be completed in that agreement. What is also interesting is recently Obama was saying that the challenge to the Gulf states is not external, but it is internal and it's domestic. Fine, thank you very much. Well, we like to hear that. And what are you going to do about it? Are you really going to be supporting democracy in the region? Are you going to live up to that expectation? We believe that threat to the region comes from external and internal. And of course, having a much more robust domestic setting helps you to avert some of these security threats. And there is a crying need for reform across the whole Arab world, across the whole Middle East. And we need the United States and although other international allies to help us, not to dictate to us the kind of democracy that they want, but to actually help the reform movement and help the government to reform and by good governance and the move towards democracy. We cannot just jump to democracy and have a Jeffersonian democracy in the Gulf or in the Middle East overnight. It has to be a long-term process, and therefore we need the United States, having had the experience, and also international, to help with doing that. We need to understand how do they, the United States, stand against vis-a-vis political Islam. If you stop political Islam becoming winning votes and becoming coming into a government, what you're going to happen is what you see today in Iraq and Syria. People are becoming radicalized, and therefore we need clarity on that. We need clarity on how much is we're going to have this boogeyman called Iran being told to us that we have to arm against and sell us more missiles and jet fighters. We need that money to actually affect development in the region. There is a lot of reconstruction that needed in Syria and Yemen and Iraq and so on. We don't need to be threatened by Iran every time we need to sell arms to us. We need to be told that Iran is a challenge. Iran has its own ambitions here, but we need you to help in negotiating not only the nuclear deal, but a much more robust regional structure, security structure that can bring Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and other regional powers into a more cooperative security arrangement that is, a win-win situation and not a zero-sum game. I think we also need the United States to tell Iran and Saudi Arabia enough is enough. This proxy war is not helping anybody. This regional hegemonic competition is not helping anybody. We don't want to be having the next 100 years of sectarian, religious, ethnic wars that has happened in other parts of the world. And we need our friends in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, to help our leadership and to help our people and to stop this, what is happening. Because to a certain extent, people here in the region see that sometimes these conflicts are also fueled by either Western intervention or the United States, or non-intervention. And therefore, we need to be clear on that. I think the region have had its own fair enough share of conflicts. And it is time that we need to move to a much more cooperative relationship. Iran is a challenge, but it's not necessarily an enemy. Iran we can have competition with, we can work with as well, and we can cooperate with. Iran is, of course, a very important strategic neighbor, and we can't just push Iran to oblivion. We have to deal with Iran, and our governments have to learn how to deal with Iran. And the United States had to bring this in. You can't just have a nuclear negotiations that is that does not tackle all the other important issues that the Gulf states fear. You can't just say, okay, we're going to have a nuclear deal, and you think that this is going to alleviate all the fears that is in the region. The region fears much more than the nuclear weapons. They fear what they perceive, rightly or wrongly, Iranian hegemonic ambitions, the Iranian intervention in the region, and and of course this has been helped by the fact that there are some Iranian voices that also fuel this fire by saying, we're controlling 4 or 5 Arab capitals, and our capital is going to be Baghdad, and all of that. We need this to end. It doesn't help anybody, and I think the United States can play a very important role in doing so.
Go ahead.
Just a few points on that. I think your point is well taken about the frustrations about the lack of direction that is either concrete or perceived in American leadership. And what I'll say is that I think that frustration is not just in this region or in other regions of the world, but it's true at home too. Americans don't like to see their own leadership as weak. And what's interesting is, and I say this not as someone espousing American dominance, but in the domestic policy realm, the public hates when they don't understand what their president thinks or wants or the policies that he's pursuing. And in a lot of ways, other nations around the world can relate to that, because while they don't live under the president in the way that an American citizen does, the president of the United States has some level of impact on the lives of everyone in the world. In some places, it's a profound impact. In other areas, it's less of one, but there's an impact. And so when that lack of leadership extends into the foreign policy realm, the rest of the world suffers, in the same way that in the domestic policy realm, Americans grow frustrated with it. And Americans grow frustrated with it in the foreign policy realm as well. What I think one of the benefits of democracy is, though, is that now there's going to be a change. There will absolutely be a change. And if my prediction is true, and foreign policy is a major part of the next election, there's going to be a lower probability of not knowing what the next president wants. Because there's going to be a series of debates, a lot of media interviews, a lot of questions being pointed at these candidates on exactly these issues. And so they're going to have to take a stand. And if they don't, they're going to look very weak in the eyes of the public, and it's going to reduce their chances of being elected president. And especially for people who want to talk about foreign policy, this gives them an opportunity to shed light on their positions in all these areas of the world. And that's a real benefit that the American system can offer. It's not that it will offer it, but it has the opportunity to offer it. And as an American and as a policy analyst, I hope it does. I hope the next president, we know exactly how they want to deal with Iran and the rest of the Gulf region and Asia and Latin America and Israel and Palestine. I'd love to have clarity on that, because it's clarity we don't have right now from this president.
Thank you very much. So from both of you, your advice is clarity, direction in terms of policy, even a vision, Abdullah, you would say, but also reassurance and restraint in managing the conflicts within the region as well. I must say, I was always taught, when it comes to the Middle East, always expect the unexpected. So the next president, just like the previous 2 or 3 or 4, will also have to deal with that as well. Right. Now, let me open up the floor. I'm sure you can do a better job than I have, so I'll start with the lady here. If you could just state your name and any affiliation, that would be great.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Malak Shabqoon, and I'm a researcher at Al Jazeera Center for Studies. I have 3 quick points. You seem very sure that Hillary Clinton will grab this presidency. While I see that there is great popularity, I do have a question about what history has shown us, when a Democrat has held office for 2 terms in a row, how great are her chances? Or is it that the Republican candidates really don't offer a better alternative, even for those who are, you know, in the middle and not sure who they're going to vote for yet, who don't necessarily identify as Democratic or Republican? That's one thing. Another thing is, given your position, can you comment a little bit about where you think Hillary Clinton herself would head on Syria? I think it's very clear that Obama, on ISIS, on Syria, both, he has no clue what he's doing, really. Or he's unsure of what he's doing. He doesn't know what the next steps will be. So if you can comment a little bit on that. And then finally, my question is about the war on terror, which continues to recreate itself. And what do you think that's going to look like, regardless of who wins? Is it going to reincarnate itself as something else? I was in the US a couple of weeks ago, and I hadn't been back home in about a year and a half, and CNN was constantly talking about the Islamic State or Daesh. So it's just like this cycle of events continues to repeat itself with different actors, different names, but the same old thing. So what do you think is going to happen after this one?
Dr. Zakaria, I'll take a few more questions. Dr. Zakaria?
Salman, I don't like to violate order.
You're
Okay,
going to be succinct and to the point as ever, Dr.
So
Zakaria.
I am shocked. I never heard the word Egypt, both speakers. I didn't hear about Egypt. Even the Egypt as a country on the map, it was never mentioned. Let me ask first, is America still the greatest? This is a question. I say no. America is only a superpower. It has a burden, a pile of economic and internal problems. Climatic, energy, ethnic, Occupy Wall Street, I don't like, and external. America is losing. Taliban is still in Afghanistan. Qasem Soleimani is still in Iraq chanting long live Iran and fighting Daesh under the cover of alliance fighters. So let us speak frankly. America needs a youth like David Cameron, Clegg, not a sick and old like you, John, a youth like you, enthusiastic and with experience. America has a lot of problems, so she needs a youth. About Egypt, I tell you all, America is fighting Daesh everywhere, $500 million. But Sisi is going to turn Egypt to Daesh in 1 or 2 years. Let the next president about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take, please, Doctor. Name and affiliation.
Thank you. I'm Ashraf Siddiqui, a political student or analyst. John, what we see in this region is that America is having a deep economic interest and also strategic interest. In spite of that, when any political issue comes, maybe it is Yemen now, or it was Syria, or it is Egypt, or it is Iraq, or any area, we see that whatever is in the interest of Israel. So do you think that the American leadership forgets the national interests?
I'd like to take a student, please, or someone who looks like one. How about you, sir?
Intern, so I guess that's close enough to a student, at Qatar University with Sesri. And my question is, one of the biggest controversies surrounding Hillary Clinton has been Benghazi, which has been kind of pushed along by the Republicans a lot. And currently Libya is falling apart. Do you think this will be a problem in the 2016 election if Libya suddenly has a huge just crisis, and then Benghazi comes back to the forefront. Would this impair Hillary Clinton's chances to a large degree?
Okay, great. Let's do some quick fire answers, and then we'll come back.
Okay, rapid fire. I'll start at the end. No, Benghazi is not going to affect Clinton. Most people have made their mind up on it, and they either see it as a weakness of hers, and those are people who would tend not to vote Democrat anyways, or they see it as a witch hunt, and those are people who would vote for her no matter what she did. Let's see. Three-term Democrats. Actually, typically, most times there's a two-term president, they aren't succeeded, but Democrats actually have a very unique history with this, because after 2 terms of Bill Clinton, a majority of American voters voted in favor of a Democrat to succeed him. He just lost the Electoral College vote. Other than that, the only time there was 2 terms of Democratic control was during the Kennedy-Johnson years, where a very unpopular Vietnam War created this odd political dynamic that Johnson and Democrats were unable to overcome. But before that was actually an unprecedented span of Democratic control of 4 terms of President Roosevelt and then President Truman. There are a lot of political reasons and demographic reasons why things are lining up well for Democrats in this term. The economy is doing well, and if you look at the Electoral College map, I don't know of a state that Obama won in 2012 that Clinton is going to lose. But there could be a couple of states that Romney won that the Republican nominee could lose. So that creates these odd demographic dynamics that I think are forces that can defy history. Hillary on Syria. You know, as I said, I think she's a more interventionist individual than the president. And when you're Secretary of State, you have a huge impact on foreign policy. But at the end of the day, it's the president's call. And so I think it is absolutely essential for an American voter and for individuals elsewhere in the world to hold Clinton to account for a lot of what happened in the Obama administration, at least in the first 4 years in terms of foreign policy. But there are well-documented differences between them, and so it's hard to entirely cue them together. My guess is she will be, I preface this by saying I'm no expert on Syria or the conflict there, but my guess is she will be certainly more firm than this president, although being more firm than Jell-O is not much of an accomplishment. She will certainly be more firm than this president on the issue, and my guess is she would be somewhat more interventionist. Yeah, that's a danger that politicians and the media in the United States love to capitalize on. I mean, I remember in the days and months after September 11, it was truly a scary time as an American, having never lived through a terrorist attack like that. And I think there was a place where media and politicians were being fairly legitimate in their fears. We've since found out there was hyper-politicization of the way in which it was handled and communicated to Americans and to people around the world. And I think you're right. There is this tendency to go back to that. I think when you hear someone arguing that somehow ISIL is just going to come in droves to the United States. I mean, I don't know if they're going to build big ships and avoid the largest navy in the history of the world. I don't know how they imagine these bands of ISIL are going to come to American shores, but people say this. People legitimately say this, and they're crazy. And so I think people have grown weary of this war on terror meme that has been used properly at times and abused at times in a way that I think people tend to see through it no matter how hard the media tries.
Both of you, Egypt and Israel.
You first.
Also the war on terror as well.
Yes, I did mention Egypt, but kind of indirectly by talking about the military coup. And basically my idea was that the United States had to be clear and persistent in its policy. If it's going to support democracy promotion, then we have to accept what democracy brings to the region. We can't have Hamas elected, for example, and then we say, well, we don't like the elections, or we have the Brotherhood in Egypt and then we don't like the Brotherhood. We have to be clear. If we really support democracy, we expect that democracy will sometimes bring people that we do not like. But we have to live with that, and that's the game of democracy. Not doing that and not staying and not giving political Islam or Islamic groups a role to play in politics, where they come through peaceful means, you're going to drive more and more people towards ISIS, towards terror and radicalization. And the war on terror has not really succeeded, as you know. Al-Qaeda now almost pales in the face of ISIL, and you know, it's considered like a weak organization when you look at ISIL. And if we continue just doing that and creating that what is perceived also as a sectarian war, you're driving more young people towards ISIL, more of the Sunni groups towards ISIL, and therefore we have to transcend this sectarian issue of a Sunni Shi'i division, and try and build nation states that are built on national interest rather than sectarian interest. So I believe that we really need to rethink the whole strategy. I mean, the whole drone attack in Yemen has not really helped to get rid of Al-Qaeda. It may have killed few operatives, but what did it do? It actually brought down the whole legitimacy of the Yemeni government. It made it weaker in front of other groups. So we really need to rethink this strategy. War on terror, of course, you need to have force against it, but that force has to be measured. But also you have to fight it with deeds. You have to fight it with clarity, with words, and stand with what you say, and to change the minds and the perceptions of the people. At the moment, there is a very that the whole region is boiling. You know, they look at the United States like if they're turning towards supporting Iran and read Shia, rightly or wrongly, but that's how they read it here. And they see that Iran is attacking ISIS, but they're not attacking, for example, other Shia militias that can be just as dangerous, and supporting one group against the other. And I think that is dangerous. It's driving many young people who are eager to fight against this perception. And I think we need to work hard in making sure that this is not a sectarian conflict. This is not against any particular group, whether they're political Islam or otherwise. That we really mean that we need the region to change towards more democracy and reform and so on, but stand by it and don't just change in the first instance you get a chance to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I actually just want to go back to the Israeli question as well. You have presidential candidates who are typically seen as sort of parroting that. I think the question refers to, is this actually harming U.S. interests? And I tie that with the demographic changes that are taking place in the U.S. And you have a U.S. president, perhaps. Is it just because of peak with Israel, or is there something else going on here which could affect U.S. policy when it comes to this issue?
So I certainly can't deny that our relationship with the State of Israel has been one that has informed American foreign policy for decades. That is absolutely certain. What has been interesting to me over the past few years, and particularly over the past year, has been that I think the American government, and certainly the American people, are starting to separate Israel from its leadership, in seeing them as two very different things. There is a skepticism in the United States now of Prime Minister Netanyahu that I never really expected to see. There's a skepticism among average Americans. There's a skepticism of, I think, his approach, even among American Jews. American Jews were not happy with the Prime Minister in coming to speak to our Congress. There's public polling that suggests that. And I think that, as I said, suggests that the public and certainly the leadership in the U.S. is starting to understand this issue, this alliance, in very dynamic terms. And frankly, and I say this next bit not as an analyst, but I think the best thing that could happen for this region in terms of American foreign policy is to stop thinking about what is good for Qatar or KSA or Israel. What's good for all of these countries is regional stability. And however that's achieved, I don't know. I certainly don't have the answer to that. But it's something that has to be understood. Economic growth and regional stability is going to help ameliorate future problems. Getting there is something tough. But when that becomes the driving force in foreign policy and not individual alliances and commitments to individual nations, that's going to be something that's healthy. One of the questions previously was about the need for more younger people to get involved, and I actually think the changing demographics in the United States are rapidly transforming the policy perspectives of Americans. We see this right now on domestic policy in a series of areas of social policy that used to be quite controversial and are no longer controversial. But I think it's also going to start informing foreign policy. Younger Americans tend to be less interventionist, less positively disposed toward military spending, and I think more open to diplomatic relations in a way that departs dramatically from neoconservatism in the United States, which has a very small presence among younger groups. In terms of, I mean, in any nation, getting younger people into positions of leadership and into elected office is actually quite difficult. I'm flattered that you think people in my generation can do a better job. I hope that's true. I'm too young to run for president, though, so I can't promise you that I'll do that this time, or any time for that matter, because I don't want the job. But I think that once people in my generation do get into positions of leadership, I think a lot of these the ideas and worldviews that surround that generation are really going to transform not just policy in the United States, but policy with regard to the United States' relations with its partners around the world.
Thank you. We've covered a lot of ground. We started a little bit late, and I'm open to another question or two. Okay, I'll start with the gentleman there, and I'll come. Is there anyone on this side? Okay, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. Khalid Al-Mizaini from Gulf Studies Program, Qatar University. Thank you for both of you, and Abdullah have mentioned a couple of times the role of U.S. in the region. But my question maybe to both of you, we see that the U.S.-Iran rapprochement that happened last year, and the changes between the relationship between Europe and Iran. What are the implications of if Clinton, if you're saying that he seems, as I agree with the gentleman over there, that you seem that you are sure that Ms. Clinton will win. What will be the implication of the new administration in the U.S. over the relationship between the Gulf countries and the issue of the Iranian nuclear? Since in the Gulf here, most political leaders here are very much aware that there is, to some extent, a U.S. inclinations towards Iran. And also the question also of the political economy of energy. I mean, I know that the U.S. had set a target of by 2016 or 2017, it will stop importing oil from the Gulf. How would that change in the future, since we know that by 2016 there will be a new president? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sir.
I'm Captain David Walker from United States Army Civil Affairs. It seems that over the last few presidential administrations, the Department of Defense has taken an increasingly central role in the formation and execution of U.S. foreign policy. So my question is, what effect do you think that this upcoming election will have on civil-military relations in the United States government? And more importantly, how can U.S. defense policy in particular best contribute to positive outcomes like the ones you described in the Middle East?
I'm almost tempted to ask you to answer that question, but I shouldn't, I know. Is there anyone else? We'll take one more. Okay. All right, gentlemen, you both have about 3 minutes each to answer and to sum up. Thank you.
According to public statements, Secretary Clinton is positively disposed toward the Iran nuclear deal. She spoke to a conference in New York just a few days ago and said we need to let this negotiation and ultimately an agreement have a chance. I think the one aspect of that we can expect out of Clinton, and I think we could also expect it out of a Republican president who doesn't renege on the deal, is that they will, I think most people in the world, and I think most people in the United States will probably be more confident that Clinton or anyone else as president will be more committed to ensuring that compliance is happening. That's the real question. Oh, there's a lot of questions here. But one of the real sticking points about this is whether compliance, or Iranian compliance with the details of this deal actually happen, or whether they stonewall inspectors or they set up barriers to understand whether compliance is happening, which in itself is non-compliance. You need a tough leader who's going to really stand up to them, and if there is even a hint of non-compliance, then sanctions go back. I think most people are confident that they're going to get something better out of the next administration on that point than they are on the current administration. In terms of the political economy of energy and energy independence in the United States, the goal of energy independence in 2016 is a great rhetoric, but it's not a reality. I mean, American energy exploration is booming right now, but we are quite a distance still from being wholly energy independent. And so that will certainly transform relations with this region if America is no longer dependent on foreign sources of energy. It certainly changes those dynamics, but also the economy in this region of the world is starting to diversify. You know, Dubai has financial institutions that have overlapping interests with American financial institutions. There are a lot of ways in which the diversification of the economy in the Middle East and in the Gulf region is something that is going to mean the transition either away from oil and gas, or a scenario in which America is energy independent. Those alliances are still going to be there in a multitude of other sectors that ensures that there won't be this dramatic breakdown in relations or this distancing between the United States and its allies. In terms of, you can absolutely answer this question better than I can, given your position, Captain, but the Department of Defense has played a remarkably increased role in the administration of foreign policy. I think that's probably in large part because we've been conducting wars for 12 years, 13 years, and when that happens, the Pentagon obviously plays a more prominent role. I will say, under a Republican administration, it will certainly play a dominant role, as Republicans tend to be very close to the Pentagon. Making a Secretary of State president, however, you can imagine will transform the importance or the role that the Pentagon plays versus the intelligence community or the State Department. That dynamic is certainly going to change. I don't think Hillary Clinton has a combative relationship with the president, but you have to assume that her time as Secretary of State has informed her perspective about the relative importance in terms of the shared roles of the intelligence community, the State Department, and the Pentagon in administering and producing foreign policy.
I think the world and the Gulf states and the whole region has to accept that what has happened in terms of the nuclear negotiation is now probably too late to change. And I think the Gulf states have tried to force or to influence the United States to change course, and that is almost impossible given the painstakingly negotiations that have taken place. And there is nowhere in the world that you have so much international will to go and conclude this agreement with Iran. So I think that is almost a fait accompli in terms of the nuclear deal. And of course we have to wait until the 30th of June to see it happening, but most likely it will happen. And if it does, it doesn't mean that Iran is suddenly going to be a nuclear power. It requires it requires to, there will be very strict checks and balances on their program. And I think the Gulf states also have to learn that relying on the United States only is not in their best interest. They have to diversify their sources. They have to diversify their strategic relationship. And I think to a certain extent they are doing so. There are no friends forever. This is the world of international relations and politics. The United States is, of course, a major strategic power to the region, but it cannot continue to be forever. And we're now seeing that there are other budding powers, especially China, but also Russia is also very interested in the region. And we've seen the French and the Europeans also moving towards the region, obviously serving their own interests. I would say in terms of energy dependency, I don't think it's going to change much. I think it will have an influence, but I don't think it's going to change much. The United States has never been, especially in the recent history, fully dependent on energy imports from the region. They've been able to diversify their sources. Energy market is very, very diversified, and there is a lot of energy production within the neighboring countries that they can rely on. And you can see the exports from the Gulf states to the United States in terms of energy is reducing year after year. But as a hegemonic power, and this is where it is important, the United States does not just care about its own consumption. It cares about world energy in total, and therefore the United States will always be concerned about this region because of the fact that this region is one of the most important regions for energy production. But also it will be concerned for this region because of the arms sales. The arms sales constitute a very important part of the American arms industry, and to a certain extent, maybe this touches your question. I think I would also agree with John that Hillary Clinton will having had her own experience being a foreign minister. And she has seen how different institutions in Europe vie for, in the United States vie for, affecting policy. I think they'll have an influence in her. But I think the reality is the United States is going to have to sell a lot of arms to the region. And therefore, the Pentagon will have a say. It's not just arms sales, it's training, it's the after-sales service. And that is one of the most lucrative business transaction with the region, and I don't think that is just going to be left aside. I think she will have to nurture that and make sure that the American arms industry is continuing to be vibrant and prospering, and trying to influence the region by selling more and more arms to it, which in fact, has shown that it has totally useless utility because, it has hardly been used or has guaranteed the security of the region. And this maybe I would conclude by saying the security of the region is not going to be guaranteed by either these arms sales or by the United States alone. It has to stem from a true regional security arrangement that can encapsulate and brings everybody together, including the enemies, as they say them, including Iran, including Pakistan, including Afghanistan. The whole region had to work together to create a security structure that can, including Egypt, sir, that can work together to create a security community. At the moment, you don't have the Arab League any longer as a security regime in the region. As we've seen its death almost, and the GCC is hardly a security community, although they are trying now to find if that will work in Yemen, we'll have to wait and see. And you have again powers like Turkey, powers like Iran, and so on. They really have to be brought in, and Iraq into the equation, and of course Yemen. So there is a very strong need to bring this all together, and the United States can actually play a very important role here, and of course the European partners as well can play a very important role. But it's up to the local government, up to the regional government to actually start to do something. Otherwise, we are going to be in this spiral case where one conflict leads to the other, and you can see it's happening all around us. And this islands of prosperity that we are in the Gulf cannot continue forever when the whole region is boiling and the oceans around us are having big waves and big winds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, Abdullah, I thought we were going to stay friends forever. I thank you both very much. It was actually said from the floor that the US is losing in the Middle East. I ask you the question, or is it maybe accepting the result? Is there, maybe with President Obama, his rule came at the time, particular time in history, but is there actually a fundamental realignment of the US role in the Middle East going on? I guess a two-term presidency doesn't quite tell us that, but let us see what comes next. I think even if that is the case, what comes with it is the responsibility of the hegemon in this region, the external hegemon, to manage that change. And I guess that role will fall on the next president's, his or her shoulders in this respect, where perhaps you'll see a mixture on the hard power as well as soft power. But certainly, as you've heard today, the challenges are many. The focus still is on stability, order, prosperity, and dignity and opportunity as well. And in that respect, I guess many would say that the US and the next US president cannot simply walk away. I remember when President Obama was doing his incredible speeches, getting up at 4 in the morning here in Doha to watch them. I dare say there'll still be great interest here in Doha and across the region as we start to get into the presidential debates. With that, let me please thank our wonderful guests, John Hudak. Travel safely back to Washington. We look forward to hearing more from you and reading from you on your blog as well with regards to the US elections. And Abdullah, friends for life, thank you so much. I hope, and let me thank you and also the Gulf Studies Center and Qatar University for this wonderful friendship and partnership. Thank you very much.